Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. Now let's talk about the First World War and its effects. Now students, here in this topic, we are going to focus on the First World War and the effect of the First World War or the effects of the First World War on Russia and the common people in Russia. Okay. Now before this, you have learnt about the 1905 revolution that was also known as Bloody Sunday. Now if anyone asks you this question that why was it known as Bloody Sunday, how are you going to explain that? You are going to explain that the event took place on 22nd January, that was a Sunday, and it turned out to be a bloody event. Why? Because the policemen, they attacked the group of workers who were marching towards the Winter Palace, right, with a petition in their hand and to question the Tsar. Who was the Tsar then? Nicholas II here. And under whose leadership here? So it was under the leadership of Father Gapon, right? Now we have learned all these points here. Moving forward, let us now understand that what happened after the First World War. When we are talking about Russia specifically here, how was Russia impacted or affected by the First World War? Now you are knowing the timeline for the First World War. 1914 to 1918, finally a peace treaty was signed in the year 1919, right? So here, when we are talking about the First World War, we know that there were two groups that were fighting among themselves here, right? So the first group here is the Central Powers and the second group here is the Allied Forces or the Allied Powers here. Now when we are talking about the Central Power, here, when we are talking about the Central Power, what were the countries here? Germany, the main countries here, Germany, Austria and Turkey. They were fighting on one side, and along the Allied forces we see that these countries, France, Britain, Russia, Italy, Romania, these were the countries that were fighting on the Allied side here. Now who was the victorious power here, students? So the answer is the Allied forces. They were the victorious powers here. It means that Russia fighting from the Allied forces side here, they were the victorious one, right? They defeated Germany, Austria, Turkey and all the other small countries that were fighting from the Central Powers side here. But let us talk about the effects of First World War here. Now looking at the map here, just have a look at this map. So here we have triple entente that we are talking about. It means that we are talking about the Allied forces here. Then neutral power and the central power, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, Turkey, these were the countries from the central power, Italy, France, UK, Russia, and these small countries, they also joined the World War I later on. Okay, so this is the map of Europe here and some other parts as well, where you can see these were the main participants of the First World War. Now, in Russia, initially the war was popular, definitely. When we are talking about Russia, we see that the war was popular here initially, okay? And everyone rallied around Tsar Nicholas II, right? But later on what happened? Tsar, he refused to consult the main parties in Duma, right? As the war, it started and as it was going on, we see that the Tsar, he refused to consult the main parties where? In Duma. Now, do you remember the Duma here? Yes, we have talked about it. So, they were the elected consultative parliament. Yes, consultative parliament, right? In short, you can also say that it was the parliament here. Now here what are we seeing? In Russia, anti-German sentiments, they ran high. Yes, students. So, what were we seeing there? So, people, they were opposing which country here? Germany. Therefore, if you remember the name St. Petersburg, do you remember the name? I told you that it was one of the most important cities in Russia. So here we see that the best example is when St. Petersburg, let me correct the spelling here, when St. Petersburg was now renamed, that was a German name, and that was renamed as Petrograd. Now, whenever you will hear the name Petrograd, grad students, it means that we were talking about St. Petersburg. So here, during the First World War, what are we seeing? That people are having anti-German sentiments, right? And therefore, anything that was representing the German name, German sentiments, anything like that, basically people, they changed those things, right? So this is how they showed their anti-German sentiments here, anti-German feelings here. But when we are talking about the casualties in the war, definitely in the First World War, we see that people are fighting from both sides, right? So here specifically in Russia, there were over 7 million casualties in the war, right? So you can see that 7 million people, they died in the war here, right? Also, there was a severe impact on the Russian industry about which we are going to talk here. But while discussing about the First World War, there is another important point that I would like to discuss here. So war on the Eastern Front was quite different from the war that happened on the Western Front here. Yes, so people fighting from both the sides here, right? So Russia is on one side, France, Germany, everyone, they are fighting from the other sides, the Eastern Front and the Western Front here. So what are we seeing? They had different tactics that they followed in this war. So representing the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Now when I'm talking about the Western Front, so the army here, they fought in trenches, right? They attacked from the trenches. Now what do we understand by trenches here? Trenches here, it means that a narrow hole dug up in the ground. Now you must have watched it in movies, students. So there is a narrow hole dug up in the ground where these army officers, they station themselves there, right? They try to protect themselves from any attacks and they try to attack from these trenches. So life in these trenches, it was quite horrible for them, right? There were dead bodies kept there, many casualties were there. They could not keep the body anywhere else. So definitely life for them in these trenches was really difficult. But when we are talking about the armies that attacked from the Eastern Front, we saw that, or we learned from all the reports that the armies here, they moved a great deal and they left a lot of casualties on their way, right? So they are moving a great deal, they are moving a long distance in order to attack their enemies here, okay? Apart from this, the Russian army, they also destroyed crops and buildings to prevent the enemies from living on the land. Now here you see the tactic that was being followed by the Russian army. So while these Russian army, they were attacking the enemies, what were they doing? On their way, they were destroying all the crops and buildings. Why? So that the enemies, they could not live, or when they were coming on this way, they could not live on these lands, right, for a longer period of time. So to make their situation much more difficult, all these crops, buildings, everything that was of necessity, that were being destroyed by the Russian army. However, we see that there were 7 million casualties in the war here, okay? Now talking about the impact on Russian industry. I told you that we will discuss it in detail here. Now we saw that in Russia, industrialization, it took place when? In 1870s, correct? Yes. Now here industries and factories are getting developed, right? Being developed in this region. But the condition of the workers who were working in these factories or industries, it was quite great. It was not that great, right? They were not living in better conditions here. So, however, we are seeing here that the Russian industries, they are very few in number. And during the First World War, we all know that these industries, they have a lot of demands, right? So when we are talking about the war, they need all kind of supplies here, be it the arms, ammunitions, and metals, any other supplies, right? Weapons we can call, in fact, food. So everything is needed in great amount when we are talking about the wars here that happen on large scale. So what are we seeing here? That Germany was also involved in the war. Russia is also involved in the war. So therefore they had to cut off their supplies. Russian industries, they were very few in number, and whatever supplies, the industrial goods that was coming from Germany, that was also cut off. So Russia was not getting any supplies of industrial goods from Germany or any other region from which they were importing these supplies, right? So here we are seeing that they are facing a severe jolt in these industries, right? Also, what are we seeing? In 1916, railway lines, they also began to break down. Now, communication lines were also cut down from different regions, right? Also, when we are talking about war, we know that people had to be recruited in the army. Therefore, they were all able-bodied men, they were required in the war, in the army. Therefore, we can say that there was labor shortage as well during the First World War when we are talking about Russia here. Small workshops that were producing essential goods, these small workshops, they were also closed down. Why? Because there was labor shortage, not enough people were there to work in these things. Apart from that, all the grains, when we are talking about the food grains, cereals here, they were also sent for army, right? People needed food there in large amount. Therefore, all these things, they were sent to the army there who were fighting in the war. This also led to the scarcity of bread and flour in the continued years. Definitely, students, what are we seeing here? We see that the common people, they were also affected with this First World War, right? So this war had an impact on the industries, and eventually it also impacted the common people who were living in these regions, who had to face labor shortage. The grain supplies, they were also given to the army to feed them, and also all the small workshops, right, that their life was based on. The common people, they were not allowed to work here. All these workshops, they were closed. So therefore we can say that common people were also being impacted here, and it also impacted the Russian industries on a large scale here. So this was all about the First World War and its effects on Russia. Coming to the question section here, we have a question that says, how was common people affected when Russia entered the First World War? So how are you going to answer this question? Right now, we just have discussed all these points here. So when we are talking about the participation of Russia in the First World War, we see that there were the industries. You can write these points down. I'm just giving you the main pointers and how you are going to form your answer if this question is being asked here. So industries, they were very few in Russia, right? And what are we seeing after that? We see that the supplies were from other countries were closed or cut off, not closed but cut off in Russia. All small workshops producing essential goods, they were also closed down, right? All able-bodied men, they were called down in the war that led to labor shortage. The food grains were also supplied to the army to feed them, right? It led to the shortage of bread and flour for the people, for the common people. So these are some of the points that you have to mention in your answer. Labor shortage, small workshops producing essential goods that were closed down, and food grains, they were also now given to the army in large numbers. Here we are seeing that they were not able to get enough food. It also led to the shortage of bread and flour for the common people, right? Also the work that they were doing, their daily wages, it was also being impacted. So these are some of the points that you have to mention here. Okay, just remember these points. Now discuss the effects of the First World War on Russia. Here, if the question is a long answer question, here you have to write or mention just about the First World War, the timeline, right? Talk about the two groups involved, two major groups that were involved here, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. Russia was fighting from the Allied groups here. Then you can talk about that initially the war, First World War was quite popular in Russia, right? But later on, what are we seeing? That Tsar, he stopped consulting the Duma, You can mention this point. Also, mention that anti-German sentiments were quite high in Russia, right? Best example is renaming of St. Petersburg as Petrograd, right? Apart from that, talk about 7 million casualties in the war. You can also talk about the Eastern and the Western Front, how they were fighting. And lastly, but not the least, this is the background, how you can start your answer. Talk about the impact here, the effects that we have to talk about is impact on industry and the common people. So again, what you have talked about in the first part that we discussed, the first question that we discussed, mention all these points here as well, right? So you will have a common answer here, but you can also give a basic background of the First World War, how Russia participated in the war to make a complete answer in this question.